Hello everyone, welcome to track 2. I'll be the moderator. My name is Kellen Thomas. I'm an associate professor and psychiatric pharmacist from Torrey University, California, calling in today from unceded Ohlone land and Oakland near Lake Merritt. And today I've been working with Chacruna and Science Sunday, and I'm here glad to be a part of the conference and seeing this presentation from Nidia Olvera Hernández, who earned a bachelor's degree in ethnohistory from the National School of Anthropology and History and a master's in social anthropology from the Center for Research and Postgraduate Studies of Social Anthropology in Mexico. Main area of interest is the modern history of psychoactive substances and drug policies. She's a professor at ENAH at the Autonomous University of New Mexico and the author of peer-reviewed articles in mainstream publications. She's currently a PhD candidate in history at the Mora Institute, Mexico City, and is researching drug control in the middle of the 20th century in Mexico. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Nidia. Looking forward to learning more about the Mexican Pharmacopoeia.
Thank you, Kellen. So first, thank you very much to the organizers and for having me here. So I'm a historian and anthropologist, and I have different research related to the history of drugs in Mexico. And now in this presentation, I'm going to show these some ideas about like the scientific research in the past in Mexico related to psychoactive plants and how some official medicine or some doctors and other scientists like botanists and chemicals try to look for the properties of psychoactive plants in Mexico and like to try to make an inclusion of these plants in this official medicine. So maybe some of you know, Mexico is famous for have a wide variety of psychoactive endemic species, and plenty plants and mushrooms were used in religion, ritual, and medical practices by pre-Columbian societies. But when colonizers arrived in the 16th century, these practices were considered idolatries related to sorcery and the devil, and were prohibited and persecuted by the Holy Inquisition and other religious authorities. But even colonial authorities distinguished the uses that seem rational, or from those they considered were mere superstitions. So like those medicinal uses that did not include psychoactive effects, mainly the topical uses or in low doses of species like peyote, toloache, that is a species of Datura, a local Datura from Mexico, ololiuhqui, that is well, from some people is Ipomea violacea, or from others is Rivea corymbosa. So I'm going to, because for example, this is the Ipomea violacea. And other, for example, like the Psilocybin mushrooms, and there usually were used in ointments to treat gout and pain, for example. No? So in this presentation aims to analyze the national pharmacopeias and other medical sources which sought to corroborate the indigenous uses and the properties of psychoactive species, local and foreign. I will specifically analyze material written between 1846 and 1961, and I'm going to focus in two species, like to look some two examples. One endemic plant from Mexico, the cactus of peyote, another plant that arrives to Mexico in colonial times and that was incorporated in local traditional and official medicine. It's marijuana. So in the 19th century, it's a moment where pharmacopeias beginning. But we have to think about that these books, all like medical books, there are a global studies, or at least from the West science. So by the 19th century, it's a very important moment in the history of drugs because various alkaloids were isolated. For example, like morphine at the beginning of the 19th century, cocaine in the 1860, and heroin in 1883. No? So at the end of this century, these alkaloids and other opium preparations, such as Dover powders or laudanum, were already being sold in the pharmacies and drugstores of Mexico, as well as marijuana, toloache, peyote, and other herbs in markets and with the traditional healers. But by this time, psychoactive plants were analyzed in Mexican institutions like the National University and the Mexican Pharmaceutical Society. Some of these investigations were published in the Gaceta Médica of Mexico. So this is like an important journal from that still exists. This journal from the National Academy of Medicine in Mexico. So this and other local academic journals published different articles related to the uses of these psychoactive plants. For example, some articles describe topics such as cocaine and its application to replace the lack of nutrition due to its properties on the digestive tract and the nervous system. Other articles talk about the multiple therapeutic applications of opium, and other articles in the Gazette say the benefits of integrate a species that it's supposed that it's a Mexican opium into national therapy, and were mentioned in order to avoid fraud deriving from the introduction of foreign products and to obtain advantage from cheapness. This plant, it's interesting because suppose this Mexican opium, it refers to this flower, this plant, that the name, like the popular name is chicalote, but and the official name is Argemona mexicana, and it's a plant of the same genus as a Papaver somniferum, and with various therapeutic applications, and which can be toxic. This is like the first Mexican pharmacopoeia. This starting in the 1846, and this was created by the National Pharmaceutical Society. This pharmacopoeia, which had the objective of determining the appropriate conditions and dosage from prescribing drugs, chemical products, and other pharmaceutical preparations. This first pharmacopoeia included various recipes with opium, like laudanum or syrup, cocaine, coca leaves, cannabis, and other international drugs. The therapeutic application with plants like toloache. For example, we have a page that shows the Papaver somniferum and how to cut and obtain the opium. The therapeutic applications with plants like toloache and local Datura, very famous for its use like a love potion. The scientists found that Datura stramonium has analgesic and antispasmodic properties, although they also pointed out its toxicity. So, for example, this is another pages with coca leaves and for example, hemp and marijuana, and this is the toloache. This is Datura stramonium. Other plant that was mentioned, well, this is the tobacco plant, and this was recommended as an enema for intestinal contractions and as a tincture against pain. Other plant is the Theobroma cacao, or the chocolate, that the butter was used since then as a body lotion. Other plants, some less known or with no clear psychoactive effects, like colorin, this kind of Erythrina coralloides. This is a tree with little red beans and was described its paralyzing properties on the motor nerves of the extremities and that it has narcotic properties. Let's remember that these are the description of these plants found on the first Mexican Pharmacopoeia. Then we are going to look in two examples. First, I'm going to talk about peyote. This plant that is endemic from Mexico and from the south of the United States. The cactus Lophophora williamsi, well known as peyote, was an important subject of study among Mexican scientists. For example, in 1913, the National Institute of Medicine published an article titled The Peyote Study that mentioned that indigenous people applied it externally against snake bites for burns, wounds, and rheumatism, for which they chew it or simply moisten in their mouths before putting it on the injured parts. It also served to fortify walkers. They rubbed their joints with the ground root, and this way they could walk long distances without getting tired. That's what this study said. Also, the peyote was described in the Latin American Pharmacopoeia of 1921. It was mentioned that it could serve as a hair tonic or to stimulate the brain, for which 2 tablespoons of a 10% tincture were prescribed. In addition, this manual mentioned that peyotina, that it supposed in that moment that it was one of the main substances for scientists from this time, was used as an intravenous tranquilizer for various cases of insanity. This is another interesting research that was the dissertation of the Dr. Jose Mazzotti, in which he compiled historical and anthropological data on botany and the geographical distribution of this plant in Mexico. He pointed out that for his study, he tried to obtain samples from different parts of the country, which he only managed to obtain from the state of Zacatecas in North Mexico. So we have, this is one of these samples. With these peyotes, he made chemical studies. He cites that of the alkaloids already found by Louis Lewin in his famous book Fantastica and other scientists, and he managed to isolate 3 and separate other crystals and components of the plant. That there are a mescaline, so I'm going to show you. Oh, this is another sample of the peyotes that these scientists use in his studies. And this is the photography that he put in his dissertation. And this is mescaline, analodium, and analodium hydrochloride. So he used these substances in his experiments with animals such as dogs, frogs, and turtles, as well as to humans intravenously. So I have this, for example. No, this is the study that he made with in the herd of frogs, and he he shows the change in the hair of this frog. And for example, this is from a turtle, and he applied the peyote in the hair of the turtle and show the change. No, that for example, this is like normal, and this is the turtle on the when he applied the mescaline. Okay. He described mescaline that like a thick, bitter liquid, dark brown in color, alkaline in reactions, soluble in water, alcohol, benzol, and much in chloroform. So he don't say a lot of things about like this is like a bad plant or it's a drug. He is looking in this plant like this, like a very scientific perspective, and looking in the change of the body of the human and on the animals, and he was trying like to study and to look also for therapeutical uses of this cactus. Now I'm going to talk about the other example, that is the plant of cannabis. The history of cannabis in Mexico, it's very interesting. Hemp arrived to Mexican territory from the old world since colonial times in order to take advantage of its fibers. However, the indigenous people who already had an ancestral experience in the uses of psychoactive species soon realized their different properties and integrate cannabis into their religious, ritual, and medicinal practices. By the 19th century, this rapid assimilation of cannabis by the indigenous population and other popular groups had generated prejudice and some confusions. Likewise, the word marijuana had already begun to be used in Mexico. The etymology of this expression of marijuana it's not certain. What is certain if there is a contribution of Mexican popular culture to the global terminology of drugs. Because some people say that maybe this word marijuana it comes from indigenous language, the Nahuatl, that is like the main indigenous language in Mexico. But some people say that is more like about related to Juana, that it's like a name in Spanish that some people use to call like women's traditional healers that sell these plants on the markets, and Juanes, that is Marias is the healers, and Juanet it refers to the soldiers. So some people say that the soldiers usually smoke marijuana, for example, in the revolution and before in other army movements. So some people say that this word marijuana it comes uh, from this situation, but we don't really know. But it's interesting because I know that some people say, for example, in the U.S. that we have to stop to saying marijuana to the cannabis plant because it's supposed to have like a racial connotation. But for me, because I'm Mexican and I'm a historian, it's more like an apportation, a contribution of Mexican popular culture. Because now in all the world, the people know what is marijuana, and especially marijuana. It's not exactly hemp. Marijuana, it's the plant, the flowers of the plant that it's used to smoke and that have the psychoactive effects. So various therapeutic uses of cannabis were already widespread among indigenous groups and popular classes when this plant began to be of interest to doctors during the 19th century. For example, in this dissertation, Genaro Perez, a doctor, mentioned that in some populations of the Republic, the use of a beverage prepared with the seeds as a treatment for gonorrhea is very common. He also alluded to the therapeutic action of the herb to treat hallucinations of the insane, stomach disorders, cephalgia, and asthma, seeds for irritation of the urinary tract, oil for galactorrhea and hemorrhoids, and cannabis extract for neurosis and for mental derangement. One of these confusions is the belief that cannabis and marijuana are different plants. By this time of the 19th century, some scientists say that marijuana was endemic from Mexico and its psychoactive effects are stronger than cannabis. Even in the new Mexican Pharmacopoeia, published in 1886, hemp and marijuana were recognized as two different species. The first was botanically identified as cannabis sativa and pointed out that the emulsion obtained from its seeds was commonly used as an emollient in inflammations. Of marijuana, the only mentioned in this pharmacopoeia said that it had sedative and hypnotic properties and that it had to be like be careful with the uses of this plant. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, scientific research on various psychoactive plants was published in Mexico. The importance of this species among indigenous communities and in popular medicine was of interest to doctors and other scientists. It should be mentioned that the exotism and some prejudice such as racial, moral, and the accusations of being uncivilized would later be stimulated with the legal prohibition of cannabis. These scientific investigations range from simple observations of consumers, chemical analysis, studied the ways of obtaining their extracts and consumption, the botanical classification of the plant, and experimentation on people and animals as well as its various therapeutic applications. By the 30s, it was said by doctors that its active ingredient of marijuana was cannabis or hashishina, a resin soluble in alcohol. In addition, some doctors studied the therapeutic application of this plant for multiple diseases such as asthma, hemorrhoids, rheumatism, migraine, menstrual cramps, and other pains, and as a sedative for insomnia, mental, and depression. But when the prohibition arrives, some things changed. It was not until the third decade of the 20th century that it began to be the marijuana wasn't endemic to Mexico. In his thesis, Dr. Ignacio Guzman, in this thesis that is in marijuana intoxication, Guzman pointed out that the species had arrived during the colonial period, that the Indians or indigenous people have its name of marijuana, and that it had widely used in prisons, among soldiers and people of the popular classes. In addition, Guzman expressed his concern about the moral, intellectual, and physical damage that may be caused, or he says it's caused by this plant. One famous Mexican scientist that made marijuana research was Leopoldo Salazar Vinegra. In 1938, Dr. Salazar published The Myth of Marijuana, an article that had the goal to eradicate some fake information. This is the article. Some fake information about cannabis. It was based on empiric experimentation with dogs and frogs that he put on inhalation boxes, and also people, including other scientists, students of medicine, or the mentally ill. He argued that cannabis had healing properties for asthma and as a pain reliever, and that there was no evidence linking this plant to criminal actions, violence, or madness. In addition, Salazar considered marijuana laws unjustified and excessive, and that drug policies should be based on a health approach and not criminalizing consumers. He believed that the only way to take power from drug traffickers was to decriminalize and regulate substance. His research had great influence on historical moments in 1940s in Mexico when drugs were legalized. But the ideas of Salazar weren't approved by Mexican and North American prohibitionists. Since the publication of the marijuana myth in 1938, a translation of these papers came into the hands of Harry Ashlinger. Okay, this is the inhalation boxes and the dog by the effects of marijuana. And Ashlinger, who was in charge of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in the U.S., the predecessor to the DEA, in this bureau, he opened a file of the investigation into Dr. Salazar and tried to discredit his research in one of the meetings of the League of Nations. In Mexico, he and his student, Segura Millán, had been warned by the Mexican government that the use of cannabis was illegal, even for scientific purposes, and that he had to stop his studies. Okay. However, it was not until the 1962 that cannabis was officially withdrawn from the National Pharmacopeia, precisely after the Single Convention of Narcotic Drugs of the United Nations. In the case of peyote, it was also withdrawn around the same time, although it was prohibited for up to 10 years with the Convention Against Psychotropics. Only to conclude, with this research, we can look that the interest of official medicine in psychoactive plants is not new and that has a long history. But the drug control changed these investigations, for example, focusing only on the damage of the uses of the plants and not on the therapeutical properties. And that's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a fascinating history. I have a question for you. So you mentioned how in the 1920s or around 1920 was prohibition of marijuana. What was driving that? What were some of the reasons that they started prohibition in 1920?
Interesting question, because in Mexico in 1920 the federal government made a law that prohibit marijuana and also cocaine, opium, heroin, and it's very interesting that the prohibition of marijuana in Mexico is before to the U.S., because a lot of people say that the influence of the prohibition in the U.S. it's in all the world, but in Mexico it's not the same. This law, the name says a lot about your question, because these laws say that these substances degenerate the race. So there is like these ideas, medical or scientific ideas of these times that the people, the scientists say that some activities or the consumption of some plants or also alcohol, it could be like transmit to their sons, so they have like to stop the uses of alcohol, or also, for example, the people that have like mental illness, it's going to be, they say that they have like not to reproduce or not to have sons because it's going to be transmitted to the other people. So this is one of the reasons. But other reason, I think, there is that marijuana, it was very commonly used in indigenous societies and in these popular classes. So from some elites, it looks that they don't like, no, like these uses, because there is like very important use in for example, like traditional uses, like in rituals and medicine, but the traditional medicine, not a lot the official medicine. So from scientists and from some politicians of this moment, it looks like uncivilized, and I think that there are some of the reasons that they decide to prohibit this plant, and also because maybe not this plant in the US, but in this moment the international norms of international conventions began in, for example, with opium, no, in with this Shanghai Convention. So Mexico, it was trying like to be in the same way of this prohibition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were talking about how several of the plants were used as topical preparations for various illnesses or ailments. Could you talk a little bit more about how did they do that? Did they sort of catalog it? Were there certain ways that they would apply it topically, or each plant was different in terms of how they would make that?
There are for example, it's interesting this situation, because I know that the science pre-colonial times, there are very common that indigenous people use, for example, like some ointments, or only, for example, the peyote to put in your hands or something, to like a pain reliever, no? So
Mm-hmm.
that was very common, the use of these plants with the use of peyote. And also there are some sources that talk about that also mushrooms, if you use mushrooms like topical use, it could be good to like a pain reliever. And other plants, for example, like daturas, there was very used, and also now it's used to if you had like an infection or something in your skin, you can use the flower of datura and only put in your hand. And for example, it's interesting that the cannabis, when cannabis arrived to Mexico, this kind of uses, it was very common in Mexico. For example, in Mexico, and also even the marijuana is prohibited. The majority of old people, I mean, my grandmother or something, know that if you put marijuana in alcohol and then you put in your hands, it's very good to the people that have a rheumatism of this kind of or illness. So there are like very different. Now we know that there are a lot of creams or things with CBD and this kind, but it comes from also from these traditional uses. So there are the very different like recipes, but I think that the most common from marijuana is in alcohol. And for example,
Mm-hmm.
in peyote, it's very common to find like very simple or very like traditional creams with only like a cream with the peyote extract.
Very interesting. So we have a question from the audience. With recent progress in relation to cannabis decriminalization and legal status in Mexico, is there any discussion on whether these medicines could possibly re-enter the pharmacopoeia, or be reintegrated into medicine practice?
That yes, because for example in Mexico, the medicinal uses for marijuana now it's legal. The majority of these medicines now we have to import it from different countries. But now one of the, I think that the purposes of to make a better law. It's like to the national scientists can make more research, and to look from these specific different therapeutic uses that we know that have cannabis. So now this is one of the an important topic in the discussions of the criminalization in Mexico, because one part is about recreational use, but another part is about like the uses of like a medicine. And now I know that a lot of people that is involved in like reform policies or these kind of things, they are looking that the people that need this plant like a medicine have access, and also have like it's not like a super expensive thing. So we need that Mexico produce marijuana, or crop up legal marijuana, and then make our own medicine. So I think that it's a very important topic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so another kind of related question is, this history of cataloging the different plants and their medicinal properties. How do you think that's influencing like the political responses today, in terms of, do the politicians seem to be aware of this history and familiar with how these are used medicinally, or is there, what are those, how are those debates going amongst policymakers?
Yeah, but in Mexico, medicinal uses now it's legal but not recreational. So, but now there are. It's supposed that there are reforms that they are trying to make legal, but there is like I don't know why there is like a stop it in the Congress. But for example, this event that I mentioned it about the decriminalization of drugs in 1940s, that this scientist Leopoldo Salazar Vinegra like promote, it's very used now in, for example, from politicians and from drug reformers to say that, okay, in one moment in the history of Mexico, we have legal drugs. That there was only for like 8 months, but now there's like an argument to say that it's not new in Mexico, and even other countries now have like a regulation, especially on marijuana. We have like an antecedent, or we have a moment in the past that we have we are having, or we have a regulation of drugs. So this is another topic that usually politicians talk about, but not a lot, to be honest. This moment, yes, but some people really don't interest history, and politicians maybe not. But
Okay. Yeah, and you mentioned a few of the different plants. You talked about how it would be used for things that would be considered psychiatric disorders and things like that. Could you talk a little bit more about how those were used, how they decided which one to use, things like that?
yes, that's. I think that the main thing is that for example, these studies were made by psychiatrists, and for example, these scientists work in, and usually made his experiments in the hospital, mental hospital. So that's one of the things that they are like you, that now in the ethics of medicine that's not right, but I'm talking about the past. So there was very common to use these people that there were patients of these hospitals, and to give different substance. And because in, for example, in these hospitals, usually they put the people that have a mental illness, but also, for example, the people that have a consumption, a problem with consumption of drugs, especially addicts. I don't know if addicts is a right word, but especially addicts with heroin, for example. So they were in the same place, and they are like catalog like, and being in, make their life with people that have I don't know, schizophrenic or that. But then also we have to think that in that moment there are no like the same uh, ideas, or the same catalogation of this illness. So they usually say that they are have madness. Now this is not right, But I think that the main information that I found related like some to treat is like the people that have depression, for example, from cannabis, or for example, like like a tranquilizer. No, it's very common that, but there are different opinions, because some people say that no, that they, so other scientists in this time say that the marijuana generate like the people be like anxious or crazy, or some people, others say that no, that it's like a tranquilizer, and that it's and you have to explore more these uses.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so, yeah, with peyote in particular, is that something do you think that they would consider for sort of like a psychedelic therapy approach, or is there any openness to that, or?
Not really. They mention that they have effects on the mind,
Mm-hmm.
but they, for example, look more other uses or therapeutic uses. For example, like in for the heart. I don't know if now there are studies about the the effects of peyote in like a tonic for the heart, but there is very common to that the scientists say or talk about these uses. And they mention that that the people have to be careful when for example not use topic, but they have to drink or take the eat the peyote, that the people have to be very careful, because it could generate some strange effects, or sometimes they say like narcotic effects, but there's no, we know that there's no narcotic, it's more like psychedelic, but they don't mention it, or I didn't found. And also they say that the indigenous people use in their rituals, and that maybe have like these hallucinations, but not a lot like that these effects it could help like in psychology or these kind of other uses.
Mm-hmm. And what's this, similar? Is it similar opinions about psilocybin mushrooms, or what it seems to be the opinion on that right now?
There's and that's interesting, because there are not a lot of investigations. They, for example, mention it on the pharmacopeias, but no, they don't make like or I didn't found, for example, dissertations that like are related to peyote or marijuana, that make more research about mushrooms. Because also we have to think that mushrooms, we have a lot of sources in colonial times about mushrooms, but then there's like a very like not evident, because we have to remember that only after Gordon Wasson in the 50s, and there are some research in Mexico in the 1930s, but only on the 20th century is that the people or the scientists put against psilocybin mushrooms like to study. So, for example, in this moment that I was talking about 19th centuries, there are no, I didn't found any evidence about scientists talking about mushrooms, only until 1930, I think. And there are not local scientists. The majority are people from, for example, Victor Reco, Pablo Reco, that came in, but they are from Germany or Austria. I don't remember, but they came to Mexico to make some research, and then only when Gordon Wasson made this famous article in Times about the mushrooms, that is like became the people or the scientists being interested in these mushrooms.
Fascinating. And could you tell us a little bit about Jose Antonio Alzate? Is that,
Yes.
and then this mixture of plants possible? Like, talk a little bit more about that from your interview.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because this guy, this was like a religious, but also like a scientist, because this he was on the mm, 18th century, so he's like a naturalist. Was like a botanist, and he was very interested in the nature of Mexico, and he wrote a very famous or a famous article in the history of marijuana, that he called something that what is people's in Sintlis. He said no, people's in Sintlis is a word in Nahuatl, in this indigenous language, that maybe means like the little venerable people, maybe related that people, the governors of the Mexicas, for example, in pre-Hispanic times, but we exactly don't know, but they say that or he say that pipilcincinlis is cannabis because he asked from some indigenous people in the markets, and then they give the seeds, and he plant the seeds, and when it grow up, he looked at its cannabis, and he was convinced of that, no, that pipilcincinlis is cannabis. But in some article I said that it's not that, because maybe it's more like a mixture of different seeds or different plants, like for example these little red beans, the Erythrina coralloides. But from the majority of historians in Mexico, say that alzate, because alzate related these people simply to cannabis, that it is. But for example, he say, and he mentioned some medicinal uses of cannabis, but also he had this idea that the indigenous uses of cannabis, they are like superstitions. So they say, okay, it's good in some hospitals in France, the medicine or the medical use to treat different illness, but here in Mexico, maybe it's not good to have this plant because the indigenous people made strange things with this plant. So it's interesting because he made important research, but at the same time he discredited the plant.
Gotcha. And in your interview article, you talked about how people had different opinions of was that actually ololiuhqui, or was it actually a different plant? Could you talk a little bit about Salvia in the Pharmacopoeia?
Evidence from Salvia, because I don't know a lot about the history of Salvia, but I know it, that I think that only by the 1970s there are the first classification like in official medicine of this plant. So, for example, some people say that on colonial sources there are evidence of maybe Salvia, but there are only like hypothetical things because we don't know. And for example, in these pharmacopeias, there's no the salvia. It's not appear. So that's interesting. That's interesting because salvia is an endemic plant from Mexico, specific from the Mazatec region in Oaxaca. But I think that the first sources that talk about salvia is 1960s, maybe 1970s, maybe 60s, but not before. So that's the reason that they're not appearing in pharmacopoeia.
Mm-hmm. And so what are some of the policy changes that you've noticed? Because you have this history going back to, like you said, the 1770s, and has this policy and sort of political opinion or public opinion changed dramatically about plants as medicines over the years? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, mainly marijuana. Now,
Mainly marijuana.
of the law, there are a lot of people that support that, for example, medical marijuana have to be legal. The people is like, oh, this is good for the convulsion of a kid. That's okay, no? But and some people, well, I mean, in like drug reformers, but it's a little group, not in the majority of the society. There are people that are advocating to legalize peyote or legalize mushrooms, for example. But I don't think that the majority of the population in Mexico think about that it's good. The majority of people still think that it's dangerous to consume, although that the people that go, there are hippies that go to consume peyote or something, but maybe like to make or to put available more information about the uses of this plant. There, some people know and they are advocating for the regulation and now for example, the other these experiments that now in different parts of the world they are making about the uses of psilocybin in depression and these kind of things, but I don't know. There is not a common topic. Marijuana, yes. Now I think that a lot of people think that it's good to use marijuana. Even people that think that it's not good, like the recreational uses, but if they have a pain, they are going to ask like to a cream and to put marijuana. But other plants, not a lot. Only like some groups of people, but not the majority of the people.
And so the ololiuhqui plant that has lysergic acid, what were some of the uses of that? What were some of the medicinal uses for the ololiuhqui plant? Were there any listed in the Pharmacopoeia?
What plant? Sorry,
The ololiuhqui?
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially like also like topic uses. That the if you like macerate the seed and with a cream, that is very good. Also like a pain reliever, and they mentioned it that it also the indigenous people use, and maybe the people have to be careful. But the majority of the uses, I think that they are from like a pain reliever, and also there is, for example, sources since colonial times, no, that the colonizers or these people in the 16th century also talk about these the same uses, no, that the indigenous people use the seed to like a pain reliever, and maybe the flower, but the flower it don't have psychoactive effects, but it has medicinal uses also, like to like I don't know how to say, but if you have an infection in the skin, also that if like toloache, if you put in an infection or something, it could help to regenerate the skin and to take away the infection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of all the medicinal plants that you just discussed, what was the most common use for, yeah, like infections like that? What was the most common plant that would be used to have like skin infections or something topical?
Marijuana, I think.
Marijuana most, yeah.
Because but more because it's like them, even it's not a local plant, but it's like very disseminated in all the country. Because for example, the uses of medical uses of mushrooms that are common, but in the communities that are still using in traditional way. I mean, the Mazatecs or different indigenous people that use mushrooms in rituals, they also know that they have a lot of medicinal properties, and they, for example, they use in low doses if they have like a flu or something, or have a headache, they use in little uses. But I think that in all the country, it's marijuana. It's like the plant that in all the country the people know that have different medical uses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have about a minute left. So any final words or final thoughts to wrap up? Sort of where do you see medicine going with plants in Mexico at the moment?
Yeah, only to say that it's good, and now there are some people that some scientists. I mean, I'm a scientist, but I'm a social scientist, but people, psychiatrists or botanists, people that now they are very interested in to look on the different therapeutic properties of these plants. So, because I 50s or this research stopped. The prohibition made that the people or the scientists don't be like interested. It's common that if you are interested before into study this plan, is like not good. No, the academic say that that's like a topic that it's not good to study, but now there is like a renaissance about the studies of this plan. So I think that this is good. That's the thing that I want to show, is that that's not new, but it's good that now there are more people that they are trying to look in the different. And I mean, I think that there are a lot of properties that we don't know that these plants, because now the thing that now is that the majority of these scientists, they are for example interested in the effects on the mind, but these have properties on the heart, on the skin, the stomach. So I think that maybe it's good that the scientists make more research in the different properties and effects on the body of the human of these plants and mushrooms. So that's all.
Great. Thank you so much for this presentation. Excellent. So we'll have take a break here, and then we'll come back with Erica Dick next.
Okay.
Right.
Going to see Erica. It's a history.
Yeah.
Thank you all the people to be here and to hear my presentation, and for the organizers to be at that. I saw that it's writing here. So thank you for organizing again this conference.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.